Thanks everybody for coming. I mean, the weather's a little crappy, and thanks for making the effort to be here. This is, I think, about our fourth in the series now, or whatever. We're up to 5. Okay, I was close. Fifth of these of really beginning to try to reach out better to our community and to help talk about and listen more about food and science and the interactions of things that I think have become very complicated and very vexing in our world of what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as we've looked at this as an institution, we see that it gets more complicated every day. And as we began to look at things, one of the things that we found is that science, agriculture, the food system, and so on have not been viewed as listening. Scientists are great at coming and telling people what they know and what they should know, and making maybe people feel not like they're so smart or respected. And we're really trying to turn that around, and this is just part of that effort. So tonight we're going to talk about feeding a growing and growing and growing population. I don't even like to use the number anymore because every report you read, the number changes. But the bottom line is we know that we have to feed more people with the same or less amount of land, do it more efficiently, with less waste, and so on and so on. And so there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of things going on, and we're going to do our best to try to help in little bits and pieces, day in and day out, try to help advance that and better understanding. So again, thanks everyone for being here, and let me turn it over to Cheryl Kirschenbaum, who is the host of Our Table. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug, and welcome to Our Table. I'm really pleased to have all of you here. This is meant to be a community conversation, so rather than just listen to me, Amaran, and the expertise of our panelists, I'm hoping that you'll be as involved as we are in the conversation. This is a topic that I'm particularly excited about because it's something that is so pressing in all of our lives, and we hear a lot about in the news, but it's hard to come to terms with how complicated a lot of these complex challenges are. And just to give you a sense of how the population is changing, when I was born in 1980, and you can do the math, there were about 4.5 billion people living on the planet. And by 2050, we expect about double that, give or take a few 100 million or so. So we are going to have a great conversation about what's involved, especially in terms of feeding that population. Because up to now, famine has been largely due to distributional shortcomings. And the Green Revolution took us very far, but we're going to have to do a lot more. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists and start by asking them several questions and then turn it over to you for a nice, thoughtful discourse. So we'll start with Ron Bates on the end. Ron is a professor of animal science at Michigan State University, and he's the director of MSU Extension's Agriculture and Agribusiness Institute. Sitting to his right, we have Jason Roundtree, who is an associate professor in animal science, and he's an affiliate of the Center for Regional Food Systems. We also have Sig Snap, a professor of soils and cropping systems ecology in the MSU Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences, and also the associate director of the Center for Global Change and Earth Observations. And we're also lucky to have Robin Buell, a Michigan State Foundation professor and William J. Beal Distinguished Faculty Member and Director of Michigan State University's Plant Resilience Institute. So thank you all for joining us. And you can find more extensive information about their bios in some of the literature here or in the event information online. So let's jump right into it. My first question's for Robin. As director of Michigan State University's Plant Resilience Institute, you and the scientists there are thinking about ways to help our food system in the face of limited resources on a changing planet. So I thought we could start by having you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges ahead, and also, to start off in an optimistic way, some of the projects that the people you work with are working on to prepare for water scarcity, energy challenges, devastating storms, and more.
Okay. So in the Plant Resilience Institute, we're focusing on trying to understand how we could help plants grow better or in more challenging climates with less sort of amendments such as fertilizer. And the reason to do this is because we know plants can produce more if they have the right combination of, say, genes or alleles. And also, you can also find microbes that can enhance how plants grow and produce, food crops. And so several projects in the Plant Resilience Institute are focused on understanding what are the microbes that associate themselves with plants. Can we catalog those, and can we find ones that are really good at helping a plant deal with stress? And one of the focal stresses is heat. So we all have heard about global warming. It is true that land temperatures are increasing, and there's changes, clear changes, and Sig will be able to tell you more about that plants are being grown, crops are being grown in different latitudes due to changes in temperature. And some things will be able to be grown further north, some things won't be able to be grown in the south because it'll actually be too hot. And one project we're working on is beans, like pinto beans and black beans, and they won't produce beans if it's too hot at night. And so one other project that we have is looking at a bean that's adapted to the desert. It really loves it hot, and asking how can it produce beans when it's very hot outside at night compared to regular dry beans like pinto beans, and seeing if we can do standard genetics to try to get beans that are adapted to higher temperatures. So those are the kinds of projects that we're working on, is looking at natural diversity in organisms, understanding how those work, and trying to look at new combinations of genes as well as microbes so that you could just coat a seed with a suspension of bacteria, and you might be able to then have a plant that deals with stress better.
So thinking about the future of agriculture as the planet changes. Turning to Sig, your research takes you from farms in Michigan to Southern Africa, and you're working in very different climates with very different cultures, but broadly you're thinking about sustainability and resilience as well. So I was wondering if you can share your perspective on our ability globally and here in the US to adapt to a changing planet, and what steps we should be taking to meet global agricultural challenges in the coming years.
Wow, you give me the easy one.
Yeah.
So I think that when we were started off by Doug Buehler brought up the really important point that scientists, we sometimes have not listened to actual practitioner and land managers. And I think the one thing I've learned since working in Malawi and Southern Eastern Africa since 1993 is that, it's actually the democracy that has come to some parts of Africa. It is the the kind of more citizen science and engaged citizenry that is my biggest hope. We have, some exciting, more big data, in crop diversification. We have these different options now, but it is smallholder farmers that really still feed about 50 to 75%, depending who you believe, of the world. So these farmers, if we can keep supporting them in their own adaptation, because they're at the front line. And so I think different types of extension that we've moved in extension. I mean, it's one of the things that originally attracted me to Michigan State is more this catalyst approach of extension to support citizenry, because they're going to have to design the solutions. The other big wave that I see that's really exciting is the Food and Agriculture Organization has really come out of the forefront of agroecology. So this idea that we can use ecological principles. So remember, ecology is not just about environment. It's always, often my students think, oh, ecologists are environmentalists. No, it's the system of science of systems. And so if we can use biology, including crop diversification to improve microbial diversity, if we can harness some of that agroecology and get the principles out there rather than top-down telling people what needs to be done. And I do see that in parts of Africa and certainly in Michigan, where farmers are more at the table. There are some farmers, I see the audience, I'm pleased to see that. So we need to have this engaged approach, otherwise we won't see agroecological solutions. They're not technology sitting on a shelf, they're co-created.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think when we talk about population, so many people think it's strictly about the numbers, when social issues, conversations, access to medicine, support of women, all of these other factors play such a strong role in how that population changes. So I can't wait to hear more. turning to Ron, thinking about being a Michigander here in Michigan, we produce more than 300 agricultural commodities and rank the second most agriculturally diverse state in the U.S. behind California. So I want to ask you, are Michiganders on the right track in terms of our long-term environmental sustainability, in your opinion? And what do you think we can be doing better?
So I do think we're on the right track. So the great thing about in Michigan is that, yes, we have so many diverse crops because we have so many different microclimates. In essence, we have developed different parts of the state to raise different kinds of crops because that's where it's best suited to grow. And so I think Michigan farmers have done a tremendous job over time taking advantage of the resources that we have here in terms of different soil types, different climate types, to be able to adapt and then be able to be successful. So, and also the great thing about Michigan farmers is that they're very interested in terms of not only how do we do it more, not only how do we improve productivity, but also how do we also take care of our resources. So I think the Michigan farms are family-based farms. These are farms that are multi-generational in many cases. And so they're always looking to see how do we be able to sustain the farm for today as well as tomorrow. And in so many cases, we have excellent examples of that. So I think going forward, I think we are on the right track. Certainly could we do better, but I think we are on the right track from a standpoint that what's unique about Michigan is that we have tremendous collaboration between the agricultural industry, state government, as well as the university. So why is that important? It's important because as we develop policy, like Sig mentioned, we're doing it collectively. So we're looking at the science. We're looking at what's going to be doable within the countryside. And we're also working directly with farmers to have them understand the importance of this and what they can do to be able to be successful. So a simple program that was started, that's run through the state government, for example, is the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program that really originated out of farmers, university people, and the state government saying, how can we work together to put together a voluntary program that's going to be the standard really for Michigan farms to be sustainable going forward. And I think that's a great example of how this system, this grouping of people, that we can do things collaboratively so much better in so many other places. Where can we do better? I think it comes back to understanding how technology is adopted on farms, doing a better job communicating that, also having people understand the impact of different avenues of compliance. Because too often on a compliance situation, we have people that don't understand what it takes to be successful on the family farm, telling people what they should be doing. Mm-hmm. And so I think going forward, having this collaborative conversation with the rule makers and being able to adapt sound science that can be effective on the farm, achieve the environmental goals we have, and most importantly, make sure the farms are sustainable for the long term and be able to hand those farms to the next generation.
And I think what's so great about Michigan is we have a lot of champions of agriculture in the policy realm who are really, really focused on this going forward. Now, Jason, you became focused. I think this part of your story is very interesting, so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about it. You became focused on food resilience the year of Katrina, which many of us remember very well, and it was devastating across scales. Scientists knew the levees would fail, but the policies weren't in place to prepare us for its impact. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the agricultural impact of what happened then, or more recently, this past into 2018 with Florence that ravaged North Carolina. So what have we learned collectively in terms of how to prepare better now than we did in the past?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure that it happens so randomly. It's often hard to prepare for something. But I got my PhD here at Michigan State, graduated around 2003, and went to LSU, and I was just going to begin a program like my mentors here had, and so we were looking at livestock production and grazing management and all those things, and then Suddenly in '05, within 45 days of each other, we got hit by 2 massive hurricanes. And before I signed up to take the job, I didn't realize that extension staff was considered first responders in food-oriented disasters. So all of a sudden I got called and was getting quizzed about all of these processes and things, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on and was ready to come back to Michigan. And so the key then, Cheryl, is like going down there. I've always been programmed to think we had this nice, cush, easy, great food system. And it has many positives. But the minute you lose power for weeks, the minute 18-wheelers can't drive down a road, we become food insecure overnight. And you see fist fights at gas stations, and you see quarrels in grocery stores. And those are things that I actually saw. And so I think then to get to your question is that I believe all skills of agriculture are important. But I think often we've tended to focus on the largest and the most commodity driven. And what I've seen in the last, 13 years is this rise of agriculture in the middle. That it isn't necessarily trying to feed this global population, but it isn't likewise just potentially going down the road to the farmer's market. That we're seeing greater regionality of our food, and that therefore because of that, it lends to more resilience based on food-based disasters. And I think that's important. And I think concurrently to that is the movement towards greater regenerative agriculture, and the fact that through, as Sig indicated, through using ecology and agroecological principles, that we can continue to grow the amount of food that we need, but we're considerably less reliant on inputs and other things that if those inputs are taken away, can we grow food or not? And I think that we've seen greater pushes in all scales of industry towards not only considering more regionality, but concurrently thinking about doing more with less inputs as well.
Yeah, and definitely something that can be applicable all around the world when there are not emergencies as well. Now, Robin, just a couple weeks ago, new research out of the University of Illinois inserted some new genes into tobacco and successfully grew plants up to 40% bigger than normal. So it's been a huge story. It was in Science magazine, and their team is now trying to do the same thing with plants that we depend on for food, like tomatoes and soybeans. Without getting into too much of the details, I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit about the potential of work like that for feeding a larger global population.
So these biotechnology approaches, they've been around for 20 or 30 years. Scientists are getting better at it. The tools are much, much more precise. The knowledge to sort of design a plant that's bigger is there's a lot more there. So I think scientists can be much more strategic about it and use these new emerging biotechnology tools and really maximize what a crop is doing in a field on many levels, not just yield, but you can also engineer it to be more efficient about recovering nutrients from the soil. You could make the plant healthier. So there's a lot of potential, but it all comes at this cost of, will society accept these genetically engineered plants? And in the United States, there's a lot more acceptance of it. Clearly in Europe, there's not. A big issue now is if you grow something and it's going to be for the export market, is there a chance that you won't be able to export your crop? Even if you're not planning to, maybe the potential contamination of the food supply chain is enough to keep that from, even emerging even here in the United States. So I think there's lots and lots of potential, and it's actually a safety issue, but I think that's really been well answered. But it's a policy issue and an economic issue, because if the farmer's worried about shipping to Japan, then they're never going to grow it. And I think that's a bigger issue, and I think it comes back to what Doug Buehler was saying is, people are not informed a lot about issues, and we do a poor job about telling them about the safety of, say, genetically modified organisms. And I think that's something we need to work on.
Maybe have more conversations with people beyond our own circles about these issues. I'm also thinking and interested in a question related to how we eat. so I hope it's okay for me to turn to you, Sig, about this, but getting to a broader point. Also this month, U.S. News & World Report named the Mediterranean diet the best option for health. And they put a panel together of experts ranging from nutritionists to specialists in diabetes, heart health, human behavior and nutrition and weight loss. And they looked at 41 eating plans, so pretty comprehensive. But more broadly, it's a plant-based diet with some meat, emphasizes fruits and vegetables, beans, seeds, nuts. It's more a style of eating. Lots of extra virgin olive oil. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how that kind of more lifestyle impacts agricultural sustainability. So how the foods we're choosing impact our sustainability long term.
So you forgot one of the most important components, which would be red wine, but
And chocolate, right?
yeah, and
Chocolate's part of it?
chocolate, yes, is right up there in Mediterranean diets that I subscribe to. So, you know, I think that, you know, whether you see, you know, that we could have environmental benefits from organic agriculture or from conservation agriculture, we're trying to conserve soil and water. I think crop diversification, and particularly crops that are directly eaten, are a big part of that. And so we need to be looking at, you know, sustainable ways to grow livestock, sustainable ways to grow crops. And we have moved, again, to go back to your analogy of from 1960, in my case, to when I was in agronomy school, we were learning about, you know, 20 different crops. And now it's really down to 4 or 5 in some locations. Even my work in Africa, people have seen the green revolution coming to Africa being about maize and fertilizers. And certainly that's one of the engines for growth, but there is fossil fuel. There's sort of some implications when we focus on bigger plants and hacking photosynthesis, and we're not looking enough at combining that with diversity of plants. So I'm going to hack this a little bit and go a little bit more towards, you know, there's Foley and others are saying, well, why don't we think about how can acres feed people? How do they nourish people, rather than thinking about how tons per hectare? So I think we do need to shift, and maybe that is part of the solution, but we do need to shift in thinking about what are we getting from agriculture? Water quality, I hope. We're getting, you know, food, obviously, and we can't forget that has to be front and center, but maybe also building soil resilience. Well, maybe we need different types of crops, including maybe some Mediterranean diet ones. So Robin and I recently joined Common Cause to write a grant proposal about sustainability. Our fingers are crossed, and it would be partly about bringing quinoa, depending how you pronounce that, and these more resilient types of beans. But these beans would also be, one thing fun about that grant is we're bringing in human nutritionists, community-based education. So maybe we've been selling Mediterranean diets and such and beans as good for you. What if we sold them as delicious and part of your culture? So I think these should be part of it, but not as a should, but as a bringing people to the table and say, what do they want? Maybe they want nutrition and local food, including meat and eggs and milk for many people, but maybe it should be more human-centric, basically.
Well, thinking of meat, as you said, some meat, we're big meat consumers in the United States, and that doesn't seem very likely to change anytime soon. Even though there are more and more startups and companies like Impossible Meats making more meat alternatives available. So thinking about this, Ron, can you talk a bit about, it's an easy one, meat production and long-term sustainability in terms of agribusiness and the environment?
So we're very fortunate in this country in that not only do we have a really large food supply available to us, but it's also over time has become much more keen into not only raising it sustainably, but also in terms of livestock in a humane manner. So the thing about meat production is that the trend has been for over 30 years to be able to make more meat more wholesome and more nutritious. So we've drastically reduced fat in meat. If you look at, what I call whole muscle meats, you look at those cuts, that we have many more that would fit within a normal dietary requirement than we've ever had before. That's without dispute. Also, if you look at the way we raise animals today, they're in a much more, what I call sustainable manner in that we have more oversight as well as better training and manure management so that we can reduce nutrient loading into the waterways as well as and produce meat in a very sustainable and wholesome manner, and also affordable for the U.S. citizens. So the great thing about U.S. residents is that we spend a very small part of our dollar on food, and that's because of the technology we've been able to use that's been able to hit those important marks of improving kind of the nutrient composition, reducing fat, also improving efficiencies, reducing environmental impact, and also making it more sustainable long term. And there's been an ongoing discussion as it relates to how do we do it in a more humane manner. And virtually every major livestock industry has multiple humane farm management or animal management systems in place where that can be verified, so that farms are not only training to improve humane management, but also that's being verified as well. So the great part is that we have this very affordable food supply that continues to evolve to be able to meet consumer demands, both from a nutritional as well as sustainability point of view.
Well, thinking about that affordability, and this will be my last question for the panel initially because you guys get a turn too. But shifting to Jason, because your work does focus on low-cost, low-input beef production.
Okay.
Beef is expensive to produce in comparison to some other agricultural staples. So I was thinking I could ask you a bit about how low-income communities are able to gain access to beef and what's been changing to make it more accessible and affordable.
I wish we could switch now. And I'm perhaps not probably the best to address those types of challenges with food security and sovereignty in those communities. But what I can speak to is I very much feel that when we look at dietary recommendations and we look at what is recommended to eat, that it needs to be under a social context that every citizen in this country has that opportunity to be able to have access to those nutrients. And I think oftentimes we tend to spin the conversation into these higher things of, well, grass-fed or grain-fed or this much O3 or omega-3 fatty acids. And then what happens is that we kind of lose track that a majority of the challenges are with people that certainly would never have those conversations. And I think that from a standpoint, to me then, from a standpoint of beef, for instance, beef is typically somewhat more expensive, and I think because of that we've typically seen greater increases in poultry consumption and to the detriment perhaps of beef, and that is something that most likely isn't going to probably change, okay? And so what it doesn't mean is that we can't, I think, more aptly address challenges with food deserts and having healthy access to healthy foods, and I think beef can be a part of that. Typically, mostly perhaps probably from a non-middle meat, but ground meat and primals up in the chuck and round, things of that nature that can typically be somewhat less expensive. And I've often tried to think about it because I do a lot with Traverse City, for instance, and Traverse City has a great willingness to purchase. But sometimes I feel kind of let down because I know, like when I think about the greater challenges we have with food security, whether it be in our urban areas, is that how does what I do, how does that help those communities? And the answer is I probably haven't done the greatest job, but I do concurrently hope and think that there are going to be these differences in terms of how we look at food systems from a standpoint of, yes, can we get potentially greater amounts of value at the farm gate, but also have opportunities that these same types of healthy products can get into these challenged areas in a way that can be affordable. I really, for instance, appreciate the way that when the work that, you know, Drew's here and others from a standpoint of our farmers markets, and how now, you know, the people can basically use the benefits they receive and get greater amounts of food for the same amount of money at those markets that give greater access to healthy food. And I think those types of strategies, being creative, will hopefully push that forward. And I think another challenge when we talk about the low cost, the reason we've got to be low cost is because each year farmers are getting less money at the farm gate. I mean, we're selling corn for $3.50, okay? And you think about that, you think about input costs and other things. And I think we really need to rationalize these challenges that we're seeing in the dairy industry and others. And so, you know, the reason that we really try to promote that is just so we can hopefully encourage, you know, viability, and that younger generations will be interested in coming into farming. It's a huge issue right now, is, you know, generation turnover. So I think I've gotten a little ADD off of your question now, but hopefully that kind of answered what you were thinking about. So
We actually touched on so many other questions that I now thought of, but I've had a lot of time. So at this point, would anyone in the audience like to ask our panelists a question? Don't be shy.
Just want the panel to address the climate change issues and how it has disproportionately affected some of the poorer countries, and what the administrators or the politicians or the planners should do about that.
It's a great question.
Yeah, I think you're
So at least I can say something more from the perspective, hopefully, of developing countries, which I tell you, there's nothing like doing a training on climate change and be talking with smallholder farmers about what is climate change, you know, what are the driving forces. And when they learn that it's basically in the northern hemisphere, some of our decisions about how our transportation systems are set up and so on, that are causing it. Because when you ask farmers, they often think it's cutting trees or something that has happened to them, something they did that was bad, and they're really shocked, and they're like, what are you going to do about climate change? Because it turns out then your lifestyle is influencing those of us in these very poor countries with very few resources, and it really brings it to home. So it's one reason I'm glad to be here, because I feel I do need to be part of this conversation, because they've charged me with that, right? You know, what are you doing about it? So I think that, again, we have a new paper coming out in agricultural ecosystems and environment from northern Malawi, where we've been working. We've had the privilege to work for like 20 years. So this makes a difference, because their farmers have been given new crop and new livestock options. They've insisted on that to help them get through, because if there's a drought, if they're growing drought-tolerant varieties, if they have better ways to store things, communities, even gender empowerment, as you said, that's often talked about, but I've actually seen it. Women say, well, my husband respects me now because I'm growing these new types of pulses, and I'm a spokesperson for this, and I'm storing it better now, and my children are doing healthier. So there's really, right on the ground, that may be only 60 villages and 10,000 people, but you can see that these communities, and it came originally out of a hospital that was concerned about health of their people coming back to food, but has developed to this direction of climate change adaptation. These villages feel more prepared now. So I think that we do have to go back to our roots, at least some of us. Obviously other people work at other levels. The ag economics have to be there, and the policies have to be in place. But climate change adaptation can really start at a village level.
Mm-hmm. I will just say I completely agree. And I think, again, going back to this sense of it not just being about numbers, when we think about the climate change challenges, it's obviously, it's not just food, it's resource scarcity and other things, but you look at the average Texan using twice as much energy per capita as the average American citizen who uses twice as much as the average person living in the UK, who uses twice as much as the average person living in China, and all those people living in places that don't have as much access to cars and technologies are going to be using more. So what can we do collectively to create those policy levers to roll back what we consume and be more efficient? But I think working from the ground up too, when you talk about the role of supporting women, what we see is the population increase is much faster in places with high child mortality and lack of proper health care measures and lack of birth control for and lack of vaccines and other medical
And lack of
technology.
girls' education.
And lack of girls' education. So what I love, and it's in a side note, but what I love is when you saw all of these models predict the speed of population growth over the last many decades, they didn't account for the fact, well, the models were primarily made by men, not judging, but they didn't really account for the fact that when women had more access to education and had more choices, they would also opt to have fewer children. So globally, we have now about a 2.5 child per woman, and it's decreasing all around the world, except in places like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of India and elsewhere. So, I mean, we are seeing these cultural shifts as well, but all of these things come together to see how we're going to be able to approach feeding all these people who are still going to be increasing. I went on a tangent. Any other question, or would anyone else like to?
Yeah, I could. So great question, George. I think, one thing I can comment on, having worked in Kenya, is that one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen is when, you land in Nairobi and you take a small plane out into the Mara, and you just see the absolute desertification that is occurring in these landscapes now. And it is primarily driven by overgrazing and by mismanagement. And often what's happening is that these small communities are competing for the same resources. And there's these cultural barriers and challenges that they face, right? Where, okay, there are five bomas, there's 5 groups of cattle, 5 communities, it's 10,000, 20,000 hectares of land. And instead of working together and trying to allow for all the animals to graze and then allow for adequate recoveries so those plants can regenerate and regrow, and instead they're competing with each other for that last bite of grass. And so now when you fly over these areas, you just see the animals in confinement in these small bomas with nothing left to eat. But livestock in that case is the backbone of their culture. And that is what their true wealth is indicated by, right? And so things that we're trying to do then is to work with the Maasai people groups in order to see, can you work together? Can we find ways to put cattle together so you're not all competing, but you're working together, which is a huge cultural shift for them, because they don't, they don't want to, I'm not running my cattle with Ron, okay? That's kind of the situation, and I don't trust Ron. And so I think then is working through those social dynamics of how do we get groups together that can work for the better good. One of the main other challenges now is through more cropping that are coming into these areas. There's a picture where I've been working of multiple elephants that were slaughtered because they got into corn. And then you lose biodiversity, you lose the natural areas. And so as much as anything, I think it's that social dynamic and how do we deal with these complexities at the local level. And to me, that's going to be a continuing aspect moving forward.
And just one quick follow-up on that also is the one thing that we have the privilege really of having people from around the world come and to MSU because of the work that folks that are sitting here have done around the world. And we talked to them about extension, which is something that is quite a novel concept to them. This idea of tying the research mission to the outreach mission to be able to move technology and information to the end user. And what we are seeing is that there's a greater propensity in the developing world to try to think about how they would mimic what we would do, how they would implement something similar to what we have that we take for granted, quite frankly. So I think there are cases where that's happening, and I think that could be one thing globally where governments, policymakers could be more persistent in not just looking for somebody else to do that for them, but also take that upon themselves so that they could have viable partners like Michigan State University to help them build their system so that they could be further sustainable and make the appropriate adaptations as climate change occurs.
I don't know how many CAFOs are in Michigan, and what is MSU doing to protect our groundwater, and how many CAFOs, what's your MSU's best thoughts about how many CAFOs we can have to protect our environment in Michigan?
So what I can't do is answer it off the top of my head. And so what a CAFO is a confined animal feeding operation. So there are particular guidelines on how those are defined. And so really that is, so that process, the permitting of that is handled through the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. And so there is a very defined process regarding how those particular farms are permitted, then how they're monitored. So what I can answer is directly how many Michigan can sustain, but what I can say is that as farms grow and if they would attain a size where they become considered confined animal feeding operation, then those are handled through the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environmental Quality, so that they are not polluting, that they have a management plan, and that they can be, for lack of a better term, good citizens within the rural, as well as the rural community and the rural environment. And I think what we have to remember in Michigan is that our farms are family farms. So these are multi-generational farms that have been successful. They have grown, and as they have grown, certainly they have been able to meet and or exceed, in many cases, the requirements to be environmentally sustainable as well as successful.
All right, I was wondering if you could touch on technology in agriculture right now. There's been a lot of news and hype, for lack of a better term, about blockchain and drones, maybe even autonomous tractors, these types of technologies that aren't for every community but could become common in the U.S. So is there anything we should know about that? What are your thoughts?
So I'm going to take the opportunity to plug an upcoming event of ours. So that so the college has an event called MSU Agricultural Innovations Days, and each year the theme changes and it moves to different locations. So this year it will be based on South Campus, and the theme is going to be precision technology that pays. So it's focused on precision technology that pays, primarily focused with row crop farmers, but will feature several different kinds of precision technology that farmers can evaluate and use and adopt within their farming systems. Certainly technology is increasing, and right now we're at a point where we're trying to understand how this fits within not only a well-managed but also profitable farming system. So we have lots of cool technology, many people working with drones. Certainly there's opportunity to use those, and looking at different potentially means to improve fertilization rates and so forth. We're using variable rate technology as well as grid soil sampling to be able to improve and again further help sustainability of the farm so they can reduce inputs, fertilizer inputs certainly, in adapting this kinds of technology. So certainly going forward over the next 20 to 30 years, we have only begun to see, I think, what kinds of technology that agriculture will be adopting. And what's so exciting is that not only is it going to be fun to see that happen, but it also, I think, helps bring the next generation back to the farm, because not only because of the opportunity to do cool stuff back on the farm as it relates to the adoption and utilization of this really expanding technology opportunities. So Sig, you could probably answer that a bit better than I can.
Well, no, but I'm just saying, I was going to say we shouldn't overlook that Kenya came up with sending money by mobile phones. They kind of leapfrogged, because you used to have to wait 10 years to get a phone in southern and eastern Africa. So when they got mobile phones, people have used these in really novel ways. We flew some drones in Malawi, but not sure how useful that will be, but we'll see. We're trying to get really intensive information working with the Center for Global Change, with the geographers there. But what I'm even more excited about is this idea that in your phone, you actually have the ability to get a free app called LAMPKS, or I think soon we'll have ability to measure nitrogen, because you can basically do that with your phone camera already. It's just calibration issues. So what I talked about citizen science earlier, in fact, we can empower farmers to dig holes. That's going to become the new thing. Going out, dig a hole in your soil. People talk about now really turning to regenerative agriculture and understanding your soil. We have to stop looking just at the surface. And so through some of these technologies, we can actually encourage people to dig holes, look at what's in their soil. And I've heard farmers in Africa saying, well, maybe I'm not going to rent this land now because it, isn't quite what I thought it was. Or maybe and these are kind of slightly higher end farmers that are maybe part of a cooperative, which I think the cooperative social innovation has to go hand in hand with these big data type of innovations. But they can support people, just like WhatsApp, which is sort of like a Facebook, these little groups of people, you can interact with them. It's improved our ability to communicate across cultures. Like when I go to a meeting now, there's often a WhatsApp group, and so we start to talk outside, and we don't divide amongst, which is unfortunate. There is still a lot of divisions in Africa on racial lines, so you go to a meeting and then the white Europeans are over here and the blacks. But now with these WhatsApp groups, you learn what that really expert farmer is thinking about, because he'll say, hey, did you see that goal in the soccer game? And did you see what I'm trying on my farm? And then they show pictures of it and show other farmers. So I think some of this big data can actually be sort of human-centric data and get people talking to each other, which it turns out people will actually spend their last dime to sometimes even less food than they should probably be buying in order to communicate. People are really driven to communicate, and if we can empower that around extension objectives like improving soil management, wouldn't that be awesome?
Can I make one more? Yeah, so great question, and I think one thing I've seen, I first of all want to always say is I don't think technology will save us. I don't think technology can defy ecology. I think it can help monitor. And to me, that's one of the biggest tools, I think, from a standpoint of at a much more massive scale. And Michigan State is a leader, in looking at these aspects. But if we can get to the point where we can calibrate at the ground level, but use satellites at this massive level to watch how water flows through environments, to watch areas that are showing greater photosynthetic capacity with the potential for more carbon capture to offset CO2 emissions, but to bring it to that big scale level, I think that's when we start being able to more aptly address challenges with eutrophication or dead zones in Lake Erie or the Gulf of Mexico and those things. And to me, I think that's what the most exciting aspect is that when we're able to use these systems to get these big scale pictures of how things are flowing, I think concurrently then there's a greater opportunity to hopefully maybe even send some of those aspects back to the farm. If a farmer can show that, hey, at my farm, these things are happening in a positive way, well, that's got to be worth something, I think, to the local community or to something grander. And so those are the things that I'm really excited about, to see how we can more aptly watch how resources flow through our landscapes. And then by doing that, we can hopefully make better decisions to take care of the problems that we have.
And Jason, would you mind just, for some members of our audience, explaining eutrophication, dead zones, and hypoxia real quick?
Sure. Well, and I'm an animal scientist, but effectively with nutrient overloads in our water bodies, it is creating algal growth, and that algal growth basically is eating up the oxygen in the water. The oxygen is lower, then we have considerably less biodiversity. Unfortunately, agriculture is a challenge. We need to continue to work to solve those problems. I think we see the greater amount of drain tile, for instance, that are going into our farming systems, and the way that we're putting water into areas that aren't natural. And I don't ever blame a farmer for making a decision. A farmer's got to feed their family, and unfortunately they're locked into short-term decision making because of the policies that we have and and the challenges that we have. And so I never want to say I blame a farmer for making decisions to move water out of a certain area to do things. But the point being is that it is a continuing and growing problem, and it's something that I think we definitely need to continue to address, and we are doing that.
And I'd just like to add that I personally would say we're at the infancy of trying to use this technology. And, you know, in 20 years, a farmer will be able to just take his phone and, you know, take a picture of his leaf and of whatever he's growing and get some immediate diagnostics like right away. I mean, think about right now, you can measure your heart on your iPhone, and soon you're going to need an apple a day so you can talk to your doctor. And, you know, that's moved really quickly. I think the smartphone's only been around 5-6 years, and I think the same thing is going to happen to agriculture. And right now, I think there's a lot of data collection. Like, we don't quite know what some of this stuff means. But I know like a big issue right now is this tar spot in corn. And, you know, you can fly a drone over a field and you can see it's there. And the question would be is if you were flying that drone, could you have seen it on the first day before like it takes over the entire field? And I think in 10 or 20 years, we'll have a lot more knowledge, and, you know, technology just gets cheaper and cheaper. And I think now the farmer, whether it's a large farmer in the US or even in Africa, they'll have so much knowledge right away just through this like phone or whatever the next thing is. Maybe it'll all be on a watch like Dick Tracy, right? But I think it's really going to change the way you do farming at every level, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, at every level.
Hi, everyone. We have a question from the Facebook live stream. Julie Barato wants to know, are we looking at a bigger problem with hunger or malnutrition throughout the world? If the food provided has higher nutritional properties, will it help curb the problem?
Yes. Sig, follow up.
Yeah, I just don't want to beat that drum again, but I really do think that nutrient-rich crops, crop diversification, has so many diverse because it turns out a nutrient-rich plant often also is good for the little tiny animals in the soil, the microbes. It's good for animals, it's good for humans. The only challenge is, guess what? You put a feast out there and all these insects and you know, microbes. Also, we get a lot of problems when we have more, we spread a table. Horticulture is, you know, a good example of that. You know, to grow an orchard is so much more challenging because you have something that's very delicious. So we have to invest, of course, along the way with plant pathologists and entomologists too, so that we can, and again in the citizen science, so that people, I think it's not 20 years away, I think it's 5-10 years from now, particularly if we don't try and over-engineer every grant. I'm always fighting to have it not all the money go for like making the app prettier, because people, there's this really somewhat sarcastic app called YAP, Yet Another Agricultural App, and it links to a whole bunch of apps that nobody uses. So we have to be careful not to have a perfect product that nobody wants. We have to, I think, design them in collaboration with farmers so that they actually are. And obviously, you know, nutrient-dense crops, we historically have been used in many parts of the world. We just need to make sure our policies are supporting them, access to them too.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, talking about the policy part of it, like again, there's this huge cultural component, because we might have the technology and we might have, you know, the technology like the emerging apps, but the technology to do the stuff on the farm, to do stuff in academia and research, but unless the policy supports that, it's not going to be widely adopted.
So I think on the last question there, in respect to the quality, if we took a commodity like wheat that continues to go up in yield, but if we historically look at that, the protein and the mineral content has been going down. And we have more people that are allergic to wheat than any other commodity in our system. So how does that really relate to the direction we're going, and whether this thing of true nutrient density in crops and taste and flavor can be a factor that maybe we're missing in the industrialized process of agriculture?
I'm not a plant guy, so.
Well, I think there's an exciting example where Karen Sehu's USDA and works with Plant Resilience Institute and others, and she's come up with recognizing that people need short cooking time beans and high micronutrient dense beans around the world. So it turns out canners here were interested. It turns out that some of the diversity that has developed these new beans came from Africa. So I think we can sometimes come up with win-wins, but there's really been a failure of imagination in some ways to think that nobody ever looked at cooking time or micronutrient density of these varieties. And so perhaps it has been a little bit about research priorities. I think we have to really make sure that we do more than, sorry to pick on the tobacco hacks, but this idea that we can improve photosynthesis for bigger plants. But it's actually about, as an agronomist, how we pack them in. Same with, you can produce a lot of protein with the current wheat varieties. So I'll push back a little bit and say, actually, yes, it's good that we have these varieties that are very nutrient dense, but we also have to figure out how to grow them. I think you'd agree with that, and make sure the soil health is correct, right? And that we are actually producing more nutrition per acre again, rather than just tons per acre. So I think we have to have a lot of people at the table, and we have to have more imagination, make sure that that we are working with the canners, we are working with consumers. They would probably want that nutritionally rich, rather than just assuming that what we want is more yield and more photosynthesis.
So I think that, how are wheat farmers paid today?
Yeah.
By weight.
Exactly. It's policy.
Yeah. And I think that you know, I think that in order, you know, that every time I work with a farmer in any aspect, they need to know if it's going to pay or not. I mean, you know that. You work with as many or more than I do, Joe. And I mean, the fact that it has to have some real changes, I think, before farmers start thinking about how to add more micronutrients back into grains.
So I consider myself, I'm more of a gardener than a large-scale farmer, definitely. And so a lot of times when I'm thinking of food production, that goes hand in hand with pollinators. And so a lot of times, I mean, lately we've been hearing about bees with colony collapse disorder and things like that. And I was wondering what you guys think about needing to produce food for our growing population, and how, if this problem continues to escalate and if we continue to lose these pollinators, how that may affect food production, especially with those smaller scale farmers that may have more diverse crops that need those pollinators.
So we're fortunate in that at Michigan State we have a really good group of people working on this issue. Certainly Rufus Isaacs has been well identified there, but also we have Megan Milbrath, who's leading the Michigan Pollinator Initiative, along with multiple people within our outstate field staff working on this issue also. So what's important that's come out of that work is that we have identified hundreds of native bees that are native, and so therefore we don't have to worry about having to bring in bees necessarily to do pollination, but how do we better improve the environment? How do we better provide food plots, for lack of a better term, for the many different native bee species that we have? So we have ongoing work both from a research as well as an outreach standpoint to help people understand how to kind of foster the environment as it relates to stimulating the native bee production within their farms, as well as then also how do we better manage those commercial bees that are brought in, and then ongoing work looking at the many different interactions of the management practices that we have that could impede or hinder the life cycle of pollinators. So the pollinators are a very complex topic, and being a pig guy, I've learned a lot about bees and in the last several years. But the fact is that it is a multidimensional problem, and we have to take multidimensional approaches. But simple things that we can do, when I say simple, being straightforward things really, is that we can provide better local environments for native bees so that we're feeding them at different times of the year so that we can maintain the local colonies and provide them the appropriate habitat. That's very inexpensive work to do. And a lot of it comes back to teaching farmers, showing farmers how to do that, and then being able for them to implement those practices. But we're fortunate. We have a very good team working on this. There's still a lot of work yet to do and a lot more research yet to be able to conduct.
And I frankly think it would be neat to do a whole hour table conversation on pollinators because it comes up a lot.
So I'm a physician, and I was interested in the comments that especially the gentleman right next to me had on the nutrition content of the wheat being poor and getting poorer with time, because I've worked in malnutrition in developing countries, and now since I've moved to the US and MSCU, I am looking at malnutrition in Michigan here, and we have identified populations that are malnourished here, and so we are trying to now go back and find why, what's the cause. We have the association, we are now looking at the causation, and it's interesting to hear about the wheat especially. I'm from Dubai and Pakistan, one of the richest and third world developing countries at the same time. And so I try and look at parallels between the rich communities and the poor communities, and there's a lot more in common than we think.
So I'll say a few words, and then somebody else can correct me if you would. So we're very fortunate in the U.S. that we have many opportunities to purchase a variety of different foods. Farmers, though, they have to respond to what the market is, and Jason is absolutely true. You know, if you're raising commodity products, wheat, soybeans, pork, milk, you are selling into very specified market chains, and you produce for those segments. We have other segments, though smaller, that we have much more diversification in those products as it relates to grains, meats, different vegetables, and so forth. The challenge, I think, for all of us is that farmers have to understand if they can be viable before they start raising food, different kinds of products. And if there's not, first of all, there's no guarantees in farming, but if there is not an understanding on their part that they can be profitable, then they're not going to do that because they have to come back and be able to feed their families and be able to pay all their bills and come back and do it again next year. So I think that's the challenge really within the American agricultural system, is that how do we send the right market signals so that we can make some of these changes, and how can farmers that are interested in growing more diverse type crops have then a market to send those into. So this is a simple example that's not related to your question, is that certainly many people understand the importance of the craft beverage industry in Michigan, and there are certainly, Michigan's now the 4th largest hop state, producing state in the country, which is, that in itself is a bit mind-boggling, and there's a tremendous interest in growing malting barley for the craft beverage industry. The problem is that the market is so undefined. So how do we shift farmers that are growing wheat to growing malting barley? Because if it's high quality barley, then there's a market. If it isn't high quality barley, there's almost no market. So it could be, they can be complete loss. And I think that's the challenge we face. And how we get there is a difficult set of answers, because it does go back to defining those market chains, defining how farmers then can respond to those.
Sorry to just come back, but so we don't really have the demand supply curves and the elasticity of demands and those kinds of metrics for the multi-wheat barley commodity in Michigan, for example?
For some of those emerging crops, those are not well defined. So, and no, just one come back to one other thing, is that what your comment was is in terms of malnourishment. You're right. And what I've read is that you can find very wealthy populations or subpopulations that are malnourished because they are not really following the appropriate dietary guidelines. And they're eating the wrong mix of foods to be able to get the right nutrient components, which is unfortunate. And so I think also on the populations, though, that are in the lower socioeconomic part of the scale, is that we have the opportunity to teach them to be able to do better.
So what my study has found that people who are utilizing food stamps are not really malnourished. It's the ones with the private healthcare insurance that are.
That's
So
a very good
it's
point. So, thank you. Because in some respects, what I was going to say is that we work a lot with people that are lower income, trying to help them manage their food dollar. And what basically our work has said, and what you've kind of verified, is that we can teach people to help themselves be able to stretch their food dollar and become better nourished.
Jason, you were part of a webinar this morning that talked about a report or guidelines for diet that's going to be released tomorrow that was commissioned by The Lancet. And one of the aspects they had in there was the idea of taxing meat. And the idea of, my understanding was to reduce meat consumption because of the greenhouse gas emissions. And when you pointed out that EPA data shows that agriculture presents about 9% or represents about 9% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and animal agriculture is about half of that. And knowing in the dairy industry, if we go back to the 40s, our cows today produce 4 times as much milk, so we need 1 cow instead of 4. And estimates show that our carbon footprint has gone down about 37%. So that's a pretty good decline. I don't think it's quite as good in the beef industry, but I know it's gone down in a similar manner. So where is this coming from in your mind in terms of the emphasis on animal agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions?
It's a great question. I think that it's very complex, ultimately, and so I always want to give an asterisk that I always want to be edifying when we talk about food choices for people that choose to eat any way they'd like to. And I think that is when basically, you know, the latest reports that are coming out that are recommending, for instance, 90% reductions in meat intake, red meat intake, right? And so where is this coming from? I think it's coming from scientists that have data that they believe that can support those calls. And you know, the thing that I was talking to a colleague, that the information age, I'm not sure anybody could have predicted the polarizing nature of what the information age has done to us. And what's happened is that it's forced us into thinking in our silos, that we have this vast amount of information and it's all exactly what we want to read. And therefore, because of that, we don't ever stop and read what anybody else is reading or what anybody else is thinking, because we can immerse ourselves in the we're right. And so effectively what happens is we only see or read what we already believe, okay? And so I think what's happening then is that there's this growing polarizing nature in science when it comes to these really complex issues of how do we feed ourselves. We know that the challenge of climate, nutrition, agriculture, social well-being, it's a very wicked problem, and it's a big challenge. And what we can do, what happens, I think, is we slice out data, we slice out certain papers, we slice out certain science, and we prop that up to say, well, look at this paper, this is what we need to do. But often, you know, science is still imperfect, and it doesn't account for that complexity at that landscape and at that nexus I'm referring to. And so what I choose to believe, Ted, is that there's always good people that are putting forth these things that perhaps they haven't considered every angle in that recommendation that somebody on the other side may have. And so what needs to happen is something similar to these tables, right, where we begin to bring people together with very differing and contrasting views and try to work together in certain aspects. And I think ultimately, for instance, I read an article today, written by Dr. Willett from Harvard that is a big proponent of lowering meat completely in the diet. But a co-author was Gary Taubes, who was like the flag waver for the ketogenic diet, right? And they're both publishing an article together to say, well, what can we agree on? And I think those are really valuable aspects in terms of moving forward.
So we've heard a lot about how stakeholders could be more involved intimately in the process, whether it be smallholder farmers or in Malawi, Kenya, or the U.S., could be nutritionists, could be preschool teachers. But how can we get effectively, I mean, Jason, you just mentioned how researchers work, who are opposite ends of the spectrum and their thinking typically can work together, but how can we, I mean, extension, we're always faced with that challenge. How can we effectively hear and integrate ideas from our stakeholders? Any thoughts maybe you have from your experiences or talking with others or have done it?
I think one main aspect is, and I feel like that we don't do this in land grant settings, is we ask enough questions to our stakeholders. I think we talked about that earlier, right, that we don't listen very well. And I think often, what happens is that we don't ask the right questions, and we don't listen. And what I mean by the right questions is that, and Ben Bartlett used to say this all the time. He was a former MSU Extension specialist, DVM, and he would say, well, if you could make more money milking 3 times a day, would you do it? So not only are you getting up at the crack of dawn, and not only are you milking late, let's go ahead and milk at 2 a.m. And, how does that going to treat your family? How's the marriage doing when you're getting up at 2 to milk cows, right? And so effectively what happens, I think, oftentimes is we get so focused on outputs, milk or yields or whatever, that at times I think we fail to address the social complexity of agriculture, which we know are suffering right now from a standpoint of mental health and function. It's a very challenging and depressing time for many in agriculture. And so back to that, I think, is that we need to ask more in-depth questions of how you're doing. I think we also need to ask, where do you want to be, right? What is your vision? What is your potential next generation's vision of what you want to be versus listening to us? And I think that would give us a much greater aspect of where our research and outreach should go. I'm sure there's others that have a question on that. But
Well, we are starting to run short on time. So what I thought might be a nice way to end it. Maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll go through the panel one more time.
So meat consumption in the United States per capita has gone up over the past century. And as hundreds of millions of people across the world come out of extreme poverty and into the middle class, the first thing they do is increase the meat in their diet significantly. And this is across hundreds of millions of people in every continent. What are going to be the consequences of that?
And Jason, please chime in as well. So first of all, it's important to understand that a lot of livestock are fed from lands that are not cultivated. So I think much of the animal products, particularly ruminant products, are fed from lands that are not suited for cultivation. Also, the great thing that we have been able to do and continue to do is improve the efficiencies of animal production across the spectrum. Virtually every species is that way. So we continue to reduce our inputs, we continue to improve our efficiencies, it reduces our carbon footprint, we're reducing the use of inputs across the board. So the animal products, and not just meat alone, but animal products across the board are important components to a balanced diet, and in many cases, in talking with people that are working in the developing worlds with animal products, are a critical component to helping particularly children be able to have the appropriate diet so that they can do better in school, and so therefore they become improving their learning outcomes such that they can then become the leaders for the next generation.
So you asked a really challenging question, and I don't have an exact answer, but I often go back to Jevons paradox. Have you heard of Jevons paradox before? Well, so there's this really smart research guy in England in like the 1600s, and England realized that, guess what, coal is a non-renewable resource, that we're going to run out of coal if we don't do something. So what happened then is England then started putting more money into the technology, and guess what, they built a more efficient steam engine. And that engine would give more output per unit input. And so effectively, that engine became adopted more and more, right? So more and more people bought this engine. As the technology came, it got cheaper. And what they actually found, and what Jevons showed, is that they actually burned through the coal faster under the auspices of efficiency than if they would have been in their slow mode in the first place, okay? And so there's always this pull and tug on what's efficient versus conserving natural resources. And so in my opinion, that if animal agriculture, we must begin to look at ways that we can produce in a more regenerative way. And what I mean by that is to have the stability of these systems that don't require as much fossil fuel inputs. And that we have the tools in our toolbox from a standpoint of biodiversity, from a standpoint of greater crop rotations, of integrating livestock back into our cropping systems that more aptly regenerate nutrients that don't cause near as much gas emissions, okay? And so what I think has to happen is that if we do indeed see, and sometimes it's easier to linearize that, oh, well, we're gonna have this much people, this many more people eat meat. I don't know, sometimes I get a little questionable about these easy parallels, but the point being is that if we have to be more apt to adopt these practices, or we're gonna blow through all our natural resources. And I think that's just a pragmatic aspect, but I do think we have the tools in our toolbox, and I think that there's an awareness of that. I've worked with people at Tyson and General Mills and McDonald's, and they're all aware of these challenges. And I think all it's gonna take is that tipping point to where McDonald's said, hey, we don't want pigs coming from gestation crates or eggs coming from layers that are in cages, and the industry changed rapidly. And I think that's what's going to happen in the next 50 years to begin to address these issues.
And sorry, did you have one question, Ted?
I can add something. So there are three biological entities that generate food for us: photosynthesis. There's three biological entities that generate food: the photosynthesis, the rumen, and the mammary gland. And if you think about the rumen, we get methane, and that's a negative, right? But if you go to the MSU Dairy Center, you'll find out what we do with methane. We mix it with food from dining halls. Can you hear me? Okay. We mix it with food from the dining halls and from Meyer, and we make energy.
So what we need to do is make a closed loop in a system. And so we need to think about how to do that. And so we have some energy coming out of that cow that we don't know what to do with. So we need to think about what to do with it and make it a positive.
And I think further to add to Jason's point, it does bring, and we've been talking a lot about animal agriculture here, but all of these pieces that sometimes seem disparate really do fit together. We have to think about our energy resources. We have to think about water scarcity and how we're going to be able to produce as much as we need to without nearly as much water available for input and all these other factors, which is what Robin's thinking about daily and so many of us. But we are very close to running out of time. So I thought that we could...
One more thing. We've been talking about protein and meat as meat, but you can get protein from other things, from beans and things, and even peanut butter and nuts. But we only need 4 to 6 ounces of protein a day. So we really don't need that much meat. We don't need to eat that 16-ounce steak. If we cut down and only eat that 6-ounce steaks, which doesn't look very big on your plate, but still, that's all the protein you need for the whole day. So.
Well, I think, though, it's more complex than that, and in all due respect, because, often we get into amino acids that are essential or non-essential, right? And we typically know that when some of these other types of proteins, one aspect that I would say that is very important with meat is the fact that they are almost 100% essential amino acids. And I think that we need to be conscientious of that a protein isn't necessarily protein. But to your point, yes, we don't need to eat the big buster in Amarillo, okay? And I think that's the aspect that you're making, and I acknowledge that point.
Yeah, and there's certainly some real health implications for eating, a lot of anything, but meat included. But I want to end by looking to some optimism for the future, hope for the future. What should we be excited about? So I'm going to throw something out, and then I thought we could, as a closing, go around and just maybe we could all add something that we feel real good about in terms of meeting the demands of a lot more people. Something that hasn't come up on this panel, but certainly will have a huge impact, is our attention to all the food that we waste. We currently throw away nearly half of what we produce in this country, which is really disturbing considering how many people go without having the sustenance that they need to go about their lives. So there's a lot more attention recently to finding solutions to reduce our food waste, which would also reduce our energy waste, our water waste, and our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think all the attention to reducing food waste is a reason to feel good.
I'd like to just say that I think there's a generational change in terms of what people are interested in. They're interested in their food, they're interested in where it comes from, they're interested in how good it is. And I think, it may take a little while for the rest of the population to pick up on it, but I can tell already young people are very interested in their food and where it comes from, and that'll make a big change.
I think what I'm excited about is the innovation I continue to see with farmers and things like these food hubs. And so waste, it's kind of like now we should eat our ugly fruit. Yeah, but actually I think we should have ways to process those into something, a pretty fruit, something I do want to eat. So I think these ways of you look at how Techmark worked with the potato industry and we became one of the go-to potato places. We were not that. So you think how by having local capacity, we used to have even more, and we have some now innovative ways to freeze vegetables and so on. So there's been ups and downs in that, and I think having local processing capacity. But I'm also going to take, since you can't cut off my mic, I want to say that one thing that's really struck me in recent years, just this last year, these reports from citizen science about massive loss of not just the bumblebee, 50% loss, but insects. We're losing biomass of insects, let alone diversity. 70% loss in Germany was reported, and then that was followed up with 60% in Spain. So these are real things. So I've been taking even more seriously that we have to really figure out how to get really creative and do things differently. Yes, it's great about some of these exciting, we've given some really optimistic things, but we do have to make some changes. These algae blooms, the herbicide resistance we're seeing, we have a number of wake-up calls out there, and I just want to put that back on the table.
Two quick things. You said one, but number one, just in the last few weeks, I was chatting with one of the heads of sustainability for one of the top 3 largest protein providers in the world, and that person indicated that he believed our future was in regenerative agriculture. And for me to hear that coming from one of the big 3 gave me hope that we are at a potential tipping point in pertaining to adapting the practices that we know, the tools that are already in our toolbox that we know that can repair and restore our landscapes. And so that excites me, and I think the aspects is that we're there. We know we absolutely know and can implement the tools that can improve land, improve water, and improve livelihoods. And I think that's what excites me, is that I feel like we're just at this tipping point where we're going to see, new aspects of agriculture, I think, that are going to really help with the triple bottom line of social well-being, the environment, and profitability.
I think what's really exciting going forward is, one, particularly in a state like Michigan, where we have such great collaboration between industry, state government, and the university, is that there's a lot of interest in working collaboratively on solutions that we all can live with, and so that farmers can be sustainable and profitable, that the landscape we can reduce nutrient loading, we can reduce soil loss, we can improve organic matter, and then ultimately look at how do we attack some of the challenges that climate change will continue to bring us. So I think working in this environment where we have so many people that are working collaboratively on common issues so that we could all reach common goals is what I'm very excited about.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists today, and I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming as well. And it's certainly not a conversation that we have to end here. We're always happy to chat more. You can contact us through our website, food.msu.edu, and I'm sure our panelists would be happy to stick around for a couple minutes and chat with folks here as well. So thank you all very much. We'll have upcoming Our Table conversations posted on our website, and thanks also to AgBio Research for supporting the initiative.
Yeah.